Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Ask Me Anything with Dr. Francis Fukuyama. I'm Carolyn Stewart, the acting editor-in-chief of American Purpose magazine, and I'm joined by my associate, Ringo Harrison. He is a research associate for us at American Purpose, and he's also been kind of the head in our outreach to the Reddit community and some of our broader efforts at engaging with folks who really care about liberal democracy. So we're so excited to have you all join us today to be able to talk with Dr. Fukuyama. And of course, Dr. Fukuyama requires no introduction. He's our chair of the editorial board here at American Purpose. He's also a distinguished professor at Stanford, and he is the author of many paradigm-changing books on the topic of liberal democracy, spanning everything from The End of History and the Last Man to his most recent published book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, which came out last year, and many incredible, wonderful things in between. So we're so grateful to be able to ask you questions today, Dr. Fukuyama. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to all the folks on Reddit. You all provided some really interesting, thought-provoking questions. So we're excited to get at it. We have about a half hour to go over these. We're going to get through as many as we can. And we just appreciate your understanding if we aren't able to get to each of the questions, but we hope to. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Dr. Fukuyama, we have a question from Don Lazy and CPT Jeff, and they ask, if you could clear up one common misconception in your area of research that too many people fail to understand, what would it be?
Well, by far, it would be about the end of history itself. I run into this roughly twice a week where somebody says, well, I guess the end of history was a lot of bunk and proven wrong. And it's almost always based on a misunderstanding of what the end of history referred to. There's still this idea out there that I was saying that events were going to stop happening and that democracy would triumph everywhere. And that, is not what the book was about. It was really about history as this long-term progression in human affairs that has extended over thousands of years. And the question is, where is that heading? So the end of history was not about any kind of termination. It was more like, what is the goal, or what do we see as the most advanced society that evolves over time? But that doesn't stop people from saying, well, the Russians invaded Ukraine, so that shows that history isn't over, or, Donald Trump is the candidate, Republican candidate, this sort of thing. So I would say by far that's the misconception that I have to deal with the most often.
Second question comes from Jacobs4525, and he asks, are the current cast of autocratic powers, China, Russia, Iran, more of a solid and indivisive bloc that challenges the liberal world order, or are they more of a loose amalgamation? In other words, are we entering a second Cold War with this autocratic bloc?
Well, that's a good question. I think that it's different from the Cold War because there isn't any underlying ideology that unites all those powers. I mean, Iran is a Muslim theocracy. China still claims to be a Marxist, Leninist state. It's not clear what Russia is. They're some kind of nationalist, but by their behavior, they're more like a fascist power. The Venezuelan regime of Nicolas Maduro claims to be 21st century socialism. And so there isn't, a common idea as there was in the days when communism was still a unifying ideology for that part of the world. So that means that we're not in anything like the bipolar Cold War world. The other thing that's really different is that, although we've been seeing a deterioration in the American relationship with China, we're still major trading partners with each other. And that was simply not the case during the Cold War. U.S. and the former Soviet Union didn't have much to do with each other economically, whereas I think every American understands that we're highly dependent. All of my hobbies, if China didn't exist, I wouldn't be able to buy, electronics or drones or, a lot of the tools that I use. And that's that puts you in a very different relationship vis-a-vis a country that is a geostrategic competitor, but certainly not an across-the-board opponent.
So now we are going to move a little bit towards domestic culture and domestic politics in the US. So we have a question from Utrud Ragnarsson. And so he asks, do you think the multicultural West is dead in the United States? Given that many religious and cultural minorities in the US frequently have views on gender and sexuality that contradict contemporary progressive views, how will progressives deal with these contradictions? Will eventually this lead to a drop in support on the left for immigration from less tolerant or backwards cultures?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's been a little bit of a sore point with me because I think that a lot of progressive activists in the United States have been pushing their cultural agenda, particularly with regard to, what are civil rights issues, mostly revolving around race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and the like. And quite frankly, it's not just, ethnic groups in the United States. I mean, the vast majority of countries in the world outside of Western Europe are not on board with this agenda. And so, because of the emphasis on especially LGBTQ rights, many people have associated liberal democracy itself with that particular agenda. So, someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary, when he says, we're building an illiberal democracy, his meaning of the word or understanding of the word liberal really doesn't have to do with, basic liberal rights like freedom of speech or freedom of association or freedom of religion. It has to do with the social agenda, of gay marriage and transgender rights, this sort of thing. And that actually has a lot of resonance with, quite a lot of people around the world. It's given an opening to Vladimir Putin because he says that that's what we're fighting. We're supporting all these right-wing nationalists across Europe and in the United States because the liberals, as he puts it, want to impose this agenda on us. And I've seen this with many of our friends in developing countries who really want democracy. They're put in this awkward situation where they, want basic liberal rights, but they're living in societies that are not comfortable with this particular social agenda. And I think that actually also explains a lot of the kind of backlash that you see. There's a recent poll that just showed that Trump was actually doing better with African Americans and Hispanics than previously, and actually doing better among them than with a lot of white working class people. And again, I think that speaks to the fact that, not everybody is as socially progressive as, the progressive part, let's say the Democratic Party. Um, I don't know that this is going to lead to opposition to immigration on the part of progressives. I do think that it really ought to be forcing them to rethink some of that agenda if they want to win elections, because I do think that a lot of the support for conservatives, for Trump adjacent conservatives, is not that people believe in their position so much as they dislike this progressive social agenda. And so I think that's, something, if you want to have power, you got to win elections. And if you want to win elections, you've got to, worry about whether you're going to alienate a lot of the base that could be voting for you. So I think that's really, what's going to play out over the next few years.
And our fourth question comes from Steak Night and your Uncle Joe. If you had read Dune, a science fiction series by Frank Herbert, what do you think it is about?
So I read Dune probably before anybody on Reddit. It was first serialized in a magazine, a science fiction magazine called Analog. And I think it was first published in the early 1960s. So I read Dune as a serial publication in this magazine before it was even out as a book. So, what I think it's about the Arab awakening. Um, you know, um, Paul Atreides is clearly the Prophet Muhammad, who um, sees this religious force coming out of the desert and then takes political control of it. And it's really intended to, be a kind of, uh, futuristic parable that, talks about the spread of, how a religion can overcome technological backwardness and become a great force, even, a couple of millennia from now. So I think that's the basic way that always saw that story. I really am looking forward to. I mean, so they've made so many different movie versions of it. Most of them, I think, have been terrible. I think the most recent one is actually the best of them, partly because it's a little bit more restrained in terms of, the costuming and the weirdness of, the civilization it's trying to depict. And it actually should be familiar in many ways because it really, is kind of an updated version of the Arab world or the Arab world of the 7th century.
That's fascinating. And maybe we could have you do a movie review when it comes out. So as one of your
Yeah, no, I'd
one
like
of your
to.
weekly columns, I think that one would have pretty high leadership. Fantastic. Thank you. So moving on to our next question. And actually, I think you might have responding to this a little bit in your first one. So SW337 asks, some on the left have argued that your book, The End of History, is a self-fulfilling prophecy since it greatly affected U.S. policy. How would you respond to that?
Oh, that's easy. So I don't think it affected U.S. policy at all. I think that gives way too much credit to intellectuals who do not set the agenda. The book, the original article was written in the winter of 1988-89. It came out in the summer of 1989 when the Bush senior administration had just taken office. And, this was a kind of Anna Mirabilis where all these miracles were happening in terms of the democratization of Eastern Europe. And the administration was always playing catch up because I think this really took them by surprise. And, it was events in the real world that set the agenda. It wasn't the book at all. And in fact, I think that there might have been one point where George Bush himself was asked about the book, and he said, I haven't read it. And certainly everybody sort of poo-pooed this idea that this was such a monumental turning point until really the collapse of the Soviet Union, when everybody had to realize that something really was different. But it wasn't my doing. And the policies that were adopted were the result of, arguments by real world politicians about real world problems and not anything that an intellectual said in a book.
Our sixth question by Colin Home asks, if a major Western democracy falls to illiberalism, what would support for liberalism in other democracies increase as a result, or would illiberalism become more enticing? We have already seen so-called illiberal democracies in Hungary, Turkey, and Poland, but so far all have continued to hold mostly regular and free elections, if not entirely fair. If Germany, France, Britain, or the United States fell to this kind of illiberalism, would liberals rally?
Well, look, we're actually in a big crisis over liberalism in the United States, right? So first of all, you have to define your terms. So the liberal part of liberal democracy has to do with constraints on the use of power, executive power. And those constraints consist of constitutional checks and balances, rule of law, the division of powers between different parts of the government that make it impossible for a president or a prime minister to simply do whatever they want. And kind of illiberal democracy we've seen is coming from elected leaders like Orban in Hungary or Modi in India or Donald Trump in the United States that say, well, I was elected and therefore the people want me to accomplish, their will. But here's a judge, here's a journalist, here's a bureaucrat that's standing in my way and I want to, get around them. But in the United States, in a way, this attempt to erode liberalism has gone the furthest because Donald Trump tried to overturn a legitimate election. and was not willing to respect the rules having to do with the peaceful transfer of power. And so this is why I think that the threat to liberal democracy today begins with a threat to the liberal institutions. It begins with elections that then put a leader in power who wants to erode the rule of law. But once the rule of law is eroded, then that leader has a lot of power to do other things, including to stack the next election. That's exactly what's happened in Hungary, right? The Orban government has gerrymandered the electoral district such that it's going to be very hard to vote the ruling party Fidesz out of power. And you see, things like that going on in the United States. I mean, got this current situation in Wisconsin where there was an election for the state Supreme Court, a liberal justice won, and the legislature now wants to use its power to basically impeach her before she's issued a single decision, essentially saying that, we're going to use our power to, violate the rules, misuse the impeachment power simply because we don't like the result of the election. So eventually the erosion of the liberal constraints on power enable the people wielding power to, figure out how to keep themselves in power. And then it's not just the liberal part of liberal democracy, but the democratic part that then goes down. And so I think, unfortunately, the United States, right now is one of the leading examples of this phenomenon.
That's sobering and a little bit frightful. So turning to the kind of flip side of this coin as we look at authoritarian actors outside of the United States, we have a question from RFK 1968 and Lego Dude 293. So they ask, how do you engage with authoritarian countries in a way that moves them towards liberalization instead of simply enabling and rewarding their authoritarianism? So we kind of have the examples, the idea that free trade could transform China or Russia, the idea of engagement with Iran and Saudi Arabia will make a difference with how they approach human rights. All those things have just kind of proven false over the years. So the question is, how do we square the circle?
Well, I don't know that there's a single answer that you can give because there are different forms of authoritarian government. So, for example, the whole third wave of democratization started in the early 1970s when the authoritarian governments in Spain and Portugal gave way to democratic ones. And in that, especially in the Spanish case, you did have a negotiated transition because there were a lot of people in the former Franco regime that were willing to democratize. But in other cases, the more recent ones, the authoritarians are not split. They're much more determined to hold on to power. And in most of the recent cases, the idea that you could be nice to them and engage them in dialogue that would lead them to any form of democratization, I think has turned out to be a total illusion. You know, the most sophisticated version of this, I think, was modernization theory, which holds that as a country gets richer and develops a middle class with a more broadly educated population, it's going to want to liberalize. And that was a theory under which we dealt with China from the 1990s going forward, that if we traded with them and as they grew richer, they would turn democratic. That, by the way, is what happened in both Taiwan and South Korea, where you had military dictatorships that at a certain point made a transition to democracy. And the hope was that something similar would happen in China. Unfortunately, that's not a universal practice. In every country, every authoritarian country is different. And the Chinese did not follow the path of South Korea or Taiwan. They actually became a tougher and more centralized and more ruthless dictatorship as they grew richer. And I don't think that there's really anything we could have done to prevent that from happening, because China is a big, sovereign country where we got rather limited influence. I think in some smaller countries, maybe a little bit, you may have a little bit more running room as the United States to try to bargain with them. It's interesting what's going on right now with President Biden visiting Vietnam. That's an authoritarian country. I doubt it's going to democratize anytime soon, but I do think that dealing with them will pay geopolitical benefits because they also are extremely distrustful and hostile to China. They fought a war with China back in 1979. And for that reason, even if they're not going to democratize, there's plenty of common interest that the United States has with Vietnam. And I think the Biden administration, or really any administration in power, would, I think, be interested in working with them constructively, not for their domestic politics, but in terms of foreign policy.
So for our eighth question from Ultra Milk Plus, he asks, how does a period of high inflation affect politics? Does it correlate with instability, populism, nationalism, extremism, or innovation and onshoring?
Well, it depends on the exact nature of the inflation. I think that nobody likes inflation, and it certainly hurt President Biden that he's been president through an inflationary period. That's why I think, despite the fact that inflation is coming down and employment is up and so forth, people are still pretty sour on Biden. But there's inflation, and then there's inflation. I visited Brazil and Argentina for the first time in the early 1990s. And I remember being first in Brazil, where they had an inflation rate of about 20% per month. Now, the United States in the 1970s had hit, like 20% inflation per year, but this was 20% a month, which is something the US had never experienced. And I thought this was an incredibly high rate of inflation. And so I said to one of the Brazilians I was talking to, must be terrible living under hyperinflation. And he said, this is not hyperinflation. So there's a technical definition of hyperinflation. I don't know what it is, but 20% a month does not cut it. They were having genuine hyperinflation in Argentina next door, which I visited next. And in that, the rate of inflation was like 1,000% per month. It meant that if you were paid as an employee in Argentina on a Friday, that evening you would run to the grocery store and buy as many groceries as possible, because by Monday, your paycheck would be worth half of what it was on Friday, right? I mean, now that's what you call a hyperinflation. And, that sort of thing is really what produces revolutions. It certainly produced a kind of revolution in Argentine politics, but in Zimbabwe, Weimar Germany, any country that lives through that kind of inflation really sees social trust undermined because, the value of your money is really important. You spend your whole life saving as a family, for retirement, for buying a house, for sending your kids to college, and then you experience that level of inflation, and basically the government has confiscated your savings. They're not worth anything anymore. And it's all being used to, cover over a fiscal deficit that is a result of an irresponsible state. And that, really does completely corrode your trust in the state and institutions and politics and everything else. So, I think that in the United States, we're not likely to see that level of distrust. We're going to see more of a kind of sourness that may get reflected in the next election. But runaway inflation is a different, or hyperinflation is a different beast altogether, and it's really much more destructive.
That's fascinating. Good context, very good context. So the next question goes in a very different direction, even more hard hitting. So Paid by the Post and Telperion's relative asks, what are some of your favorite songs?
Well, this may characterize me as a certain kind of old fart. So it's interesting. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1952. And so when I was coming of age, the Beatles had just come to the United States and the Rolling Stones and, probably the classic group for my particular generation was a band like the Grateful Dead. But I actually didn't like that music. I actually thought that American popular music had started to go downhill in the 1950s with the introduction of rock and roll. And I actually really liked um, the music that had been produced in the decades beginning in the 1930s and 40s, particularly the female singers at that time, that then became known as the Great American Songbook. I've written about this in this piece. I keep re-upping every July 15th on the birthday of Dorothy Fields, because Dorothy Fields was, in my view, the greatest American songwriter of the 20th century. She, wrote all these classic songs with Jerome Kern and, other composers like Sunny Side of the Street, I Can't Give You Anything But Love. I mean, these are all classics, in any lounge that you go into anywhere in the world, you will hear these things being played. And it seemed to me that it spoke to a kind of basic American optimism. But this was not from my generation, right? This was like my father's or even my grandfather's generation that listened to this kind of music. But I've actually I have a music server where this was before streaming. I have digital copies of a lot of things, and I can, I've got like 15 different versions of Lush Life, which was this Billy Strayhorn was a saxophonist for Duke Ellington, and he wrote one of these classics, Lush Life. And so I got like 15 different versions of it sung by every singer, from the 1920s to the early 1950s. So that's my favorite kind of music.
And to bring it back to politics, touch the Cathol. And Ken Balbury asked, the Sahel has seen a wave of regime changes very recently. In general, former French colonies seem much less politically stable than former British colonies. The usual explanation I see is that France still effectively has a colonial empire in West Africa. What do you think is the cause?
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of academics have written about the legacies of British and French colonialism. I'm not sure that the colonial master has made that much of a difference, because Britain has had some really successful colonies like India or Hong Kong, Singapore, but some real disasters like, Sierra Leone. So their record is pretty mixed. However, we have this summer fellows program at my center at Stanford where we invite civil society activists to come to campus for 3 weeks. And this summer was very interesting because we just had a really strong contingent of people from the Sahel. So people from Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, that part of the world that has seen, a whole string of coups. The latest one is in Gabon, but there was a coup in Niger that happened right at the beginning of our summer fellows. And the discussion that I had with these people was really fascinating because they are all very sophisticated political observers. And they said that this is all about France, that the people that were living in these former French colonies were really sick of the French, that French had intervened. For example, they basically were supporting the regime in Mali. They've been there for years, ostensibly to fight jihadists. And, they haven't been successful. The jihadists have gotten stronger while they're there. And they haven't really done anything except protect French economic interests. And so even though the ousted president of Niger was, quote unquote, pro-Western, actually the coup makers were really more interested in driving the French out of their country than any kind of grand ideological orientation. They're certainly not jihadists themselves. And they wanted to teach the French a lesson. And a lot of the surrounding people, even though this was an anti-democratic coup, were very supportive of it because they said, we hate the French too. So I'm supposed to actually go to Paris next month and debate Emmanuel Macron. And I am, one of the things I'm going to have to ask him is, what's with French policy in West Africa? Because you don't seem to be making yourself, very popular in that region.
Well, it sounds like that's going to be a fascinating debate. And it's good to know that the answer to the question is France. France is the reason why all these things are happening. So now we have a question that kind of relates to wokeness in the US and the end of history. So your work. And so Reddit user Francis Fukuyama, so not to be confused with Francis Fukuyama, but he must be a big fan, he or she asks, in the end of history, you write that liberalism is the end of history because it is the only political system that is balanced. Correct me, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong. Megalothymos, the
Yeah.
need to be recognized over others, and isothymos,
Yeah. Mhm.
the need to be recognized merely as equals. So, however, wokeness seems to offer a new enticing formulation, megalothymos in the person of isothymos. This
Yeah,
idea
that's
that
actually very clever. Yeah.
yeah, and kind of this user kind of sums it up a little bit more, and we made a few little edit tweaks. Yeah, that idea like I can prove my virtue and gain recognition over others by pursuing more and more radical ways to be equitable. And so the user asks, it seems that wokeness appears to satisfy both megalothymos and isothymos better than liberalism. Is wokeness the next stage of history?
Well, okay. That's actually a very clever question. And I think at the core, there's a good insight there, which is that the problem with wokeness is the following. In a liberal society, we accept diversity and we are tolerant of diversity. And so, therefore, I think in a truly liberal society, let's say you're transgender or you're gay or lesbian, there's an obligation to respect that difference and not to, victimize people or treat them prejudicially, so forth. Tolerance is the central virtue of liberalism. But I think that with many woke people, they're not satisfied with tolerance, that they want to actively make sure that under the surface you're thinking the right thoughts about other people. And so they actually want to shape the way that you're thinking. So, for a classical liberal, if you treat other, races, ethnicities, genders, or sexual orientations, you treat them equally, you don't give them preferences, you don't discriminate against them. That's all you need to do. But I think in woke circles, you also want to make sure that, they're thinking the good thoughts, whether they're behaving, uh, even if they're behaving, appropriately. And therefore, indoctrination becomes part of the agenda, and therefore you want to use the educational system to make sure that you're not just tolerant, but you're positively, affirming of these alternative ways of life. And I think in a liberal society, there's no obligation to do that. We tolerate other people having other religious practices than us, but we don't insist that you believe those other religions. And in the same way, I think that what liberalism enjoins is that we not discriminate against, people of different sexual orientations, genders, and so forth. But it does not enjoin us to all have the same views, and one of the problems I think with especially the transgender activists is that they want you not just to be tolerant, but they want you to accept certain positive assertions like there's no relationship between biological sex and gender, which in my view is an absurd, I think just it's empirically an absurd idea, but you have to affirm that kind of view if you are then going to be declared free of prejudice, right, or not transphobic or whatever. And so I think that this is a distortion of liberalism. I don't think I hope it's not the next stage of liberalism, because I think that once you get into the business of actually forcing people to mentally conform to a certain set of ideas, you've left the realm of liberalism and, it becomes something actually much more authoritarian. But that certainly has been the tendency in many, progressive circles, is to move beyond liberalism to, this kind of assertion of a kind of uniformity of thought that is, distinctly not liberal.
All right. And for our 12th question, we got from, quote, if Trump dumb asks, which region of the world do you think is most likely to become more liberal in the next 20 years?
Oh, I think Iran and the whole Persian Gulf. Iranian friends have said this to me, that when this theocratic regime in Tehran falls, that Iran is going to be the most secular society in the world, because they've been living under this theocratic dictatorship for all of these decades, and virtually everybody in the country hates it. And so they're going to be militantly anti-clerical, once the regime is out of the way. And I think, the whole Persian Gulf is in for a big social revolution. In the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, um, all of those places have pretty good higher education systems, and every single one of them is graduating more women than men. And and this is true, by the way, in Iran as well, where majority of college graduates are women. And I just do not see how you're going to maintain these patriarchal societies, at a point where all the women are a lot smarter and better educated than the men are. It may be a tough struggle to actually realize, greater actual juridical equality, but I do think that those places are creating a socially revolutionary situation for themselves.
It's going to be fascinating to watch over the next years and decades, just how they kind of deal with that and how they circle back to it. So
Yeah.
it's great. So our next question is from Unknown, and they ask, of all the international relations experts that you've known over the years, and especially in regards to the ones you find yourself disagreeing with, who among these experts do you respect the most and why?
Well, the opposite of that question I could have answered easily. It's John Mearsheimer, who's an old friend of mine, but he has driven me completely crazy with his stupid argument that he makes about Russia and the Ukraine invasion. That's a good question, as to which of the experts I like the best. My own view about this stuff is that at least in international relations theory, they have all these schools of, constructivism, liberalism, uh, realism, and so forth. And it's always seemed to me that these distinctions are always a little bit artificial, and that you have to be partly all of them in order to really understand the world. And I'm not quite sure who represents, that particular school. So maybe I'll punt on that question.
That's perfectly fine. And I'm just going to ask one quick follow up to that question, because I feel like our folks who are going to be watching this are going to be curious. So you're quite active on Twitter/X. Are there individuals on Twitter/X that you think folks should be following? Not necessarily IR experts, but just who are some smart thinkers, people who always pop up in your feed that you really appreciate?
One person that I've really come to appreciate is Noah Smith. He's got a Substack, and he's very active on Twitter. He's an economist, and I think he writes pretty intelligent things about the economy. And I think politically we're pretty aligned. I mean, I don't think he has any illusions about, the authoritarian forces that are out there in the world, and, the need to be wary of them. But he also does, fundamentally believe in a liberal world order. So I've enjoyed reading him a lot. My friend Anne Applebaum is really great on virtually anything that she writes about. I just saw her in Kiev, and I think that her judgment is, really pretty good.
And for our 14th question from Amish Revenge, he asks, what woodworking piece are you most proud of?
Well, I guess I would have to say it's a pair of Pembroke tables that I made when I was still living in Northern Virginia. So we had a house in McLean, and there's a stream in the back of the house. And one summer, a walnut tree that was about, I would say, 8 or 9 inches in diameter fell in our backyard. And so I took a chainsaw and I cut it into 3-inch slabs, and then I dried them. It spent a year drying outside, and then a year drying inside. And then I cut the 3-inch slabs into 1-inch boards, and I turned them into a pair of inlaid Pembroke tables. So this was in this period, we're living in Washington in a colonial style house. And so I really admired federal furniture that was the dominant furniture style in the period of American history, but could never afford any genuine federal furniture. So I started teaching myself how to make it. I made a federal card table, but then with all this walnut at my disposal, I decided to make these Pembroke tables. So they're drop leaf tables with an oval top. They have inlaid legs and medallions in the center of the table. The project from beginning to end took me 5 years, from the moment the tree fell in my backyard to the moment those tables were finished. It was completely exhausting, but it's probably the nicest work that I've done.
Sounds like a worthwhile hobby, and hopefully the federal colonial Virginia style, made its way to the West Coast.
Yeah, well, we
Do
still
you still have it?
still have those pieces. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, so to kind of wrap things up, we're coming up on our time limit here. So we have one more question for you, asked by Poland Ball 2101. Will nation building become more prevalent in the future? Do you think it will be more or less successful than it's been in the current era?
Well, I think it's going to be less prevalent. We had two really pretty disastrous efforts at that in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't think that there's much stomach anywhere for doing something similar. A lot of times you end up trying to build nations because you don't have much choice. A country that's really critical just collapses. In a sense, if we can bring the Ukraine war to a successful conclusion, we'll have a big nation building task where outside powers are actually going to be asked to play a big role in physically reconstructing Ukraine, but also helping them, rebuild their political system. So we can't completely avoid that responsibility. But I think the idea that you're going to go into a poor and chaotic country the way we did Afghanistan and then create stable institutions is such a tall order that at this point, I would hope that we've learned that we're not very good at that and that we should, figure out other ways of dealing with that kind of situation other than military occupation and then, these incredibly heavy investments in, building new institutions and societies that we don't understand very well.
Well, thank you so much for answering that question and all the other questions that we've talked about. We've covered a lot of ground, and I know in particular the Dune question will make many folks happy. So
Okay.
this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Just a quick plug. If you enjoyed this video and these questions, please make sure to subscribe to American Purpose, become one of our members. We rely on memberships and donations to keep the lights on, so to speak. And Dr. Fukuyama has an incredible weekly blog with us. Frankly, Fukuyama, it's absolutely fantastic. We try to make it available to some of our folks on Reddit, but also appreciate you reading it on our website. So thank you so much. And Dr. Fukuyama, do you have anything that you're working on right now that folks should keep an eye out for?
Well, I, did start this Frankly Fukuyama YouTube channel that's linked to American Purpose. It started out as a way of advertising my blog posts, but then I kind of use it as a general purpose place to put the videos I've been producing. So you can go there and subscribe to it. And, it will be related to the stuff I write for American Purpose.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Fukuyama. Ringo, thank you so much for your help and everything you do. I hope this was an interesting conversation for all the folks who are going to be watching. And thank you very much. And we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Great to talk to both of you.